Yeah.
Okay, so shall we begin? My name's Anne Crone and I'm based in the Sociology Department here. And it's a real pleasure to introduce Helen Kennedy, who's Professor of Digital Society at the University of Sheffield. And her most recent book in 2016 was called Post Mine Repeat, Social Media, Data Mining and Ordinary Whole-Grade, but apparently she's not going to talk about that. She's going to talk for about 40 minutes and then there'll be time for about 10 minutes or so questions at the end. So.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to speak. I've been told to stand still because it's being recorded, but I can still do that, and so I will, and I hope you can all see and hear me. Okay, so we're here because data increasingly matter, and it's also the case that the main way that most people will get access to this increasingly important data is through their visual representation. Data are mobilised graphically, Gittelman and Jackson say. So I'm going to operate more or less with this definition of data visualisation from Andy Kirk's book of that name, the representation and presentation of data to facilitate understanding. Data visualisations come in all sorts of forms, and I'm going to show an utterly random sample in the background here while I kind of sum up what I'm going to try and do in this talk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on a range of projects that I've been working on to think about data visualisation from a humanities and social sciences perspective. And to think about the possibilities that data visualisation opens up, but also simultaneously some of the problems that visualising data brings with it. And my research into data visualisation started with this Seeing Data project that looked at how people engage with data visualisations that they encounter in their everyday lives. And it has finished officially, but it has gone on to generate a range of other projects. So the list on the right-hand side there is the menu from the Seeing Data website, where you can click through to a range of other projects that are current and ongoing. And as John said yesterday, there are lots of collaborators. Blame them and find out who they are by clicking through on these lists, because there's kind of too many to mention now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make 4 points, and I'm going to argue that they're all important and that we need to find ways of thinking about data visualisation that holds on to all of these 4 points. So the first relates to the belief in the power of visualisations to promote greater understanding of data, doing good with data. The second relates to the belief that data visualisations privilege certain viewpoints and serve as mechanisms of power and control. In the third point, I'm going to try and tie up some of the kind of pragmatics involved in making data visualisation with a few things about the political context that surrounds us today. And I'm going to finish by answering one of the questions that was raised in the last session, which is how do data make us feel? Which is the title of a couple of presentations that I've kind of given elsewhere, so about the emotional dimensions of engaging with data through visualisations. So, to the first point, many visualisation practitioners believe that representing data visually makes it possible to communicate data effectively and gives people an opportunity to examine data sets which would otherwise be difficult to understand. Stephen Few says of DataViz and InfoViz that they, quote, make the world a better place, and you can't get much more impactful than that. So there's this belief that visualization can promote greater understanding of data, make them accessible, make them transparent, that through visualizing data it is possible to do good with data, which is the strapline of this US-based visualization agency, Periscopic. It's a trademarked tagline as well. And this view that through visualization you can do good with data was widespread amongst visualization designers that I interviewed as part of my original seeing data research. And it's an idea that can be traced back to the work of Otto and Marie Neurath in the mid-19th century, and their development of a graphical language which is called Isotope, which you can see here, which was a visual way of representing quantitative information through icons. And they believed, quote, that visual education is related to the extension of intellectual democracy, end quote. And they put these ideas into practice in museums they directed, where they used charts to enable the general public to understand social and economic issues. So, writing about the Neuraths, Zambrano and Engelhardt link these kind of ideas that they had about what visual representations of data can do to more contemporary examples. So, for example, there's the Gapminder project, which describes itself as a modern museum on the internet, which, you know, parallels the work of the Neuraths then. And the idea behind Gapminder is that it helps make the world understandable, promoting global sustainable development by visualizing related statistics. Or we might also look at the work of lots of other contemporary data visualizers. I'm choosing just one here, Stephanie Possebeck, whose work, like this project here, the Open Data Playground, is a set of floor-based games that provides people with the opportunity to play with materializations of open data sets and so explore the data for themselves. And there's lots more, there's many, many examples that we could give in this vein. I want to highlight a couple of more examples now because I want to come back to them later on in the talk. So I don't know if anyone has come across this highly acclaimed visual representation of migration flows. It's called the global flow of people. It's online, it's interactive. If you scroll over the lines, it will tell you how many people move from certain parts of the world to other parts of the world. And this is quite interesting because it's academic research translated into data visualization, which is something that I'm going to talk about. And I also want to introduce the work of the Migration Observatory, who are based at the University of Oxford, because they were partners on the Seeing Data project, and we used data that they had gathered in relation to migration as a case study on Seeing Data. One of their data sets was millions of data items about the co-location of words describing migration in the British press. So what do you think is the most common word that precedes the word migrant in the British press?
Nigel Farage.
No?
Economic.
Not illegal, correct. Illegal. This is how much more predominant it is than any other word that precedes it in the British press. So these are efforts of the Migration Observatory themselves, who are not data visualization experts, attempting to visualize their data using Tableau, a publicly available visualization platform, to communicate about some of the things that they've found. And in these examples, this is work produced by an award-winning Dutch-based visualization agency called Clever Franca, using the same data sets. And you can see that it looks quite different, and that's something that I also want to come back to later on. So these ideas, Joanna Drucker, in her book Graphesis, describes as realist these ideas about what data visualization can do. And she says they're realist and they're rooted in the empirical sciences, but we might want to describe them as perhaps idealistic, right? That data viz can make the world a better place, make data accessible, transparent and comprehensible. I'm going to come back to that. But what I want to do now is to move on to my second point, which will kind of describe to you a very contrasting set of ideas about data visualization. So critical commentators argue that data visualizations privilege certain viewpoints, perpetuate existing power relations, and create new ones. And we can see this, for example, in the work of Valerakis, who did an MA dissertation at the University of Amsterdam, and he argues that this US Republican Party's visualization of the then Democratic Party's healthcare reforms is an overcomplicated visualization which intends to make the reforms look overcomplicated as well. And this is another example from a UK-based academic called Murray Dick, who looks at the way that the Daily Express use InfoViz and DataViz to communicate an anti-trade union ideology. So this is a couple of examples of critical commentators pointing to the ideological work that data visualizations do. I would note, though, on the whole, a lot of people that are making this critical argument about data visualization don't come up with the concrete examples that Dick and Valerakis have. It tends to be a kind of generalized critique of data visualization rather than one that's based on concrete examples, and that's important to the argument that I am moving us towards. So, critical commentators point out that data visualizations are not neutral windows onto data, which is kind of implied in that first set of ideas that I presented. Visualizations are the result of numerous choices. Ambrosio says, visual manifestations of data are themselves informed by judgment, discernment, and choice. And linking big data and mapping, Kate Crawford reminds us that just as the map is not the territory, which is a kind of well-known phrase from critical cartography, so the visualization is not the data. Visualizations constitute the world as much as they represent it. And yet, as Evelyn Ruppert says, they, quote, pretend to be coherent and tidy. What she means by that is they seem objective, even though they're not. And this appearance of objectivity has a number of origins. So they report numbers which are historically trusted because they appear universal, impersonal, and neutral, as Ted Porter argues in this book, and a number of other people who are doing kind of interesting sociology of quantification, sociology of metrics and of datafication. And data and visualization are often also associated with science, which is also seen to be objective and therefore trustworthy, even though plenty of us in this room know that it's not the that's not the case, but try convincing my 14-year-old son of that. Okay, so following on in this kind of laying out of some of these critical perspectives, in her book, Beautiful Data, A History of Vision and Reason since 1945, Orit Halpern argues that data visualization play an important role as forms of governance and control. And the date 1945 is important here because she argues that cybernetics and related developments in communication sciences that were happening at the time resulted in a shift in how we are trained and how we train ourselves to observe. Okay? And this is a shift based on the management and analysis of data. She argues that new forms of perception emerge as a result of this shift, and these reflect new forms of governmentality. So she draws on Foucault to argue that visualization results in a reorganization of the senses, which is critical to the tactics of government at any given moment. And Louise Amore makes a similar argument to this as another example in an article called Lines of Sight, which is about the practices of governing migrants at borders based on data. And there she draws on the work of Jonathan Crary and his work on the history of observation, the history of perception, to argue that visualization enacts modes of attention which are central to the ways in which lives are made governable. So the strong association is being made here in this work between visualization and government and control of populations. So one of the things that, going back again to Joanna Drucker's book, Graphesis, she kind of contrasts the kind of realist as she describes them, beliefs in what visualization can do, which she sees as rooted in the empirical sciences, with what she describes as a more humanist project, which would be making all of those processes that result in a visualization visible and comprehensible, not kind of hiding them under the carpet, which is kind of implied but not stated explicitly. But one thing that I think is really important to note is that for plenty of good data visualizers, they recognize that both of the perspectives that I've described so far are valid. So visualization might make data more accessible and comprehensible and might make the world a better place, but producing visualization involves manipulating and transforming data in particular ways, often for particular purposes. And this was evident in the interviews that I carried out on the Seeing Data project, and where many of the visualizers that I interviewed said that they would like to see users understanding that when they look at a visualization. They would like to see the kind of critical literacy skills amongst users, so that users then ask themselves what's being left out, what point of view is being privileged here, and they approach visualizations critically. One interviewee said that understanding that in visualizations, some things, numbers, have been transformed into other things, images, is important. In other words, it's important that users comprehend that a visualization is a representation of data and not the data themselves. And we can see this kind of recognition amongst professional practitioners of the fact that visualization is the result of numerous processes in some of the how-to data viz guides that are out there, at least in some of the good ones. So again, Andy Kirk's book that I referenced at the beginning, it includes extensive discussion of the ways in which visualization involves decision-making about what to prioritize, what to leave out, how to present and represent data, and that all of this influences how the visualization and the data therefore look. And what he argues is that you have to make all of these data treatments and transformations visible to your users. You have to note them and you have to share information. And he's quite vehement about this. He would say that if you don't, you're lying. And that's the sort of language that he uses to talk about this. So this means making transparent the perspective that's influenced the visualization design. In the world of visualization design amongst professional data visualizers, I think a really interesting example of their own debate about how different approaches to the same data can result in different messages can be seen in this visualization here and responses to it. Has anyone seen this before? No, nobody? Oh, one person, a data visualizer in the back there. So this was produced in 2011 for the South China Morning Post. It's called Iraq's Bloody Toll. It's deliberately evocative, right? It's an upside down bar chart with rounded ends. It's red and it's called Iraq's Bloody Toll. And it says to us, too many deaths in Iraq. But a couple of years later, Andy Cotgreve, who works for the software company Tableau, remade this visualization, making 3 changes to it. So what he did was he flipped the bar chart up, he used blue instead of red, and he called it Iraq, Deaths on the Decline. And so his point here is about the impossibility of neutrality in data visualization. The same data can be represented in different ways to create different messages, all of which are ostensibly trustworthy. So I use this as an example of the debate that's going on within data visualization circles about some of the things that some of the critical commentators kind of stand outside data visualization and critique. So what I've presented so far, these 2 contrasting views. Data visualization might make the world a better place, it might make the world a worse place. And I am intentionally taking you on a roller coaster of emotions about data visualization here. I'm hoping that you would at first go, oh yeah, data visualization, and now you go, oh no, data visualization, and I'm going to do that again, and then try to kind of reach some emotional stability at the end. These two contrasting views, how do they coexist? How can we make sense of their coexistence? So in an article that I wrote with Rosie Hill, George Aiello and Will Allen, we tried to make sense of the coexistence of these two contrasting views by focusing on the work that visualization conventions do. So we focus in on some conventions that you can see repeatedly across visualizations, and we argue that they imbue visualizations with the quality of objectivity. They produce the impression that visualizations are showing the facts, even when this is not visualization designers' intention. So the conventions that we talk about in that paper include two-dimensional viewpoints, which create a sense of objectivity, either through top-down views as in maps, making it possible to see the whole nation as if we were everywhere at once, godlike, and that's a phrase from Crescent van Leuven, sort of esteemed visual communication scholars. Or you might also say that about chord diagrams, back to the global flow of people again, or even pie charts. They all encode this godlike view and create a sense of objectivity. Another convention that we look at is the use of simple geometric shapes. So rectangles, circles, triangles, pentagons create what another visual culture commentator, Gombrich, calls a sense of order. Their use simplifies data, highlighting only some of their characteristics. Another convention that we talk about is the use of clean layouts, which we say creates a sense of simplicity. So data visualizations are often marked by an absence of decoration, and you then get this aura of clarity and simplicity, which has rhetorical, persuasive effects. It rubs off on the data so that they too look clear and simple, and contributes to this sense that in a visualization we can see the data directly. Here it is, uncluttered and clear. But to use conventions like geometric shapes and clean layouts is to tell a story about data that doesn't necessarily correspond to reality. So, for example, in the global flow, great as it is, it creates a sense of migrant journeys as simple journeys from A to B, where the reality is a journey from A to B, back to A again, maybe to C via D, and you end up in B if you're lucky, maybe back at A again. So there is a kind of masking through these conventions. The final convention that we talk about is the inclusion of data sources, and we say that this creates a sense of transparency. We can see the data on which the visualization is based if we choose to, and that makes it trustworthy. It gives us a message about the veracity of the visualization, even though for lots of us we wouldn't be able to make sense of a raw data set if we saw it in that form. So it tells us that designers have been true to data, it ascribes transparency and trustworthiness, or in Latour's term, it transports truth. So what we want to do through that discussion of conventions in that article, and in noting that a lot of professional data visualizers, the ones that we've encountered, acknowledge visualization's lack of neutrality, is to challenge overly critical perspectives which assert that visualizations are tools and forms of governmentality. And that's something that I'm going to come back to at the end. But let's get back on the roller coaster and what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the skills that you need to make a good data visualization, and I'm going to situate them in a political context. So there are some designers here for whom these skills might seem child's play, but let me tell you, they're not child's play for a lot of social scientists. Okay, and I'm going to talk about them quite quickly because my intention is to make you feel overwhelmed by how difficult it is to make a good visualisation. And in a way, I hope my friends and colleagues at the Migration Observatory won't mind. I showed you those contrasting visualisations of what they tried to do themselves in Tableau with what award-winning Clever Frank did for them to show you how difficult it is to make a good data visualisation. And these are all of the things I'm going to talk about. Let's go. So, what tools are you going to use? There are hundreds of software tools and applications. You've got to choose some. Andy Kirk tries to help us on his website by listing 268 of them, and you can scroll over and read about them and think about whether that's the right tool for you. And then there's also proprietary tools that aren't even in this conversation. You've got to make a decision about what graph or chart type you're going to use. There are over 50 chart types with names, so they're kind of the recognisable ones, but you might take a very experimental and as yet unnamed format for your visualisation. What's your purpose and therefore what's your tone? We can see that that matters here with Iraq's Bloody Toll, and what we can also see here is that colour communicates meaning. It's not just decorative. So, you know, thorough knowledge of colour theory wouldn't go amiss here if you're a social scientist thinking about visualising your data. What axes, scales and symbols are you going to use? We made this up, but it's based on a real-life bar chart that we saw in a departmental meeting where the axis starts at 80 and therefore makes Ravenclaw look much worse than they actually are. And we were Ravenclaw in the visualisation that we based this one on. How much annotation are you going to include? Alan Smith, who's the data visualisation editor at the Financial Times, says that people are scared of writing on charts, but actually it's quite a helpful thing. As you can see here, he adds annotation and it helps us to make sense of this visualisation. You've got to think about how much interactivity. That's a different story. I'm not going to talk about it today because it's a long one. But you also have to think about your users or your audience or your publics. There's no right word to use here. But this group of people are often overlooked and or decontextualised in data viz research, not just by research social scientists new to visualisation, but for people researching in this field. And that's what motivated us to undertake the C in Data project, which was basically saying, oi, what about publics, audiences, users, citizens, and so on. But we do need to think about who they are, the context in which they engage with visualisations, and what this means for how to make an effective visualisation. So, all that's going on, not easy, but I think that increasingly people feel compelled to gather, mine, analyse and visualise big data, and it involves doing all of these things. And what I want to suggest is that we might see this as what Ros Gill describes as one of the hidden injuries of neoliberal academia. So, the academia isn't the only place that is being neoliberalised. Working conditions that include increased risk, individualisation, insecurity, and constantly having to adapt to technical change lead to this feeling that we constantly have to update our skills and reskill, change our skills as well. So if you combine that set of debates that I've not done justice to in half a minute with what Lisbeth van Zunen describes as the data delirium that has brought us all together here today, whether to cheerlead for it or to criticise it, this results in this feeling amongst researchers of feeling compelled to engage with data and visualise it despite not having the requisite skills. And these pressures are experienced secretly and silently, Ros Gill says. So she takes this kind of Foucauldian perspective again, arguing that the self-monitoring, responsibilised subject that is the academic researcher manages these problems sort of secretly and silently. And what's more, as universities are increasingly brought into competition with each other, increasingly look like businesses, this is a backdrop against which our own institutions' enthusiasm for data visualization might be cause for concern. It might be motivated by a need to operate within a market in which visualization is seen as a means to sell the research capabilities of universities. And if data visualizations are simplifications, as I've suggested, then the loser here is the complexity, the rich complexity of research findings. And you could make this same argument about the impact agenda. Visualizations might be mobilized in the interest of the impact agenda, but what that means is kind of lack of interest in the rich findings of research with certain consequences. I've suggested visualizations produced by academic researchers are not always of fantastic quality, and I'm saying that that is not the fault of the individual researcher, but of this kind of political context. That means research is not always well communicated, it might result in confusion and misinformation, and that's not only a problem for the knowledge claims of particular visualizations, but for knowledge itself. So my final point, back on the roller coaster, is but this is not the complete picture. What's missing from that is an account of how data and data visualizations make us feel, an account of the pleasure, the passion, and the political motivation involved in visualizing data. It's enjoyable, as many of our interviewees pointed out. So here's an example. I really enjoy it, no restrictions except for colour. I was free and the data set was rich, so yeah, it was like one big adventure. And pleasure sometimes derives from the perceived good that visualisers feel they're doing through producing high quality visualizations that are faithful to data and pleasing to look at. So one of the data visualisers that I interviewed actually describes himself as a truth and beauty operator. That's his job title that he's given to himself. So here, literature about cultural and creative labour is useful for helping us make sense of the coexistence, again, of the kind of neoliberal self-monitoring problems that I talked about and the pleasures involved in producing data visualisation. So I'm thinking about the work of Andrew Ross and others like David Hesmontalsh and Sarah Baker, who argue that a passionate attachment to work sits alongside some of these kind of more troubling conditions. And in this book, the authors develop a model of good and bad work in the creative industries, in which good work is constituted, amongst other things, by interest and involvement, excellent products, and products that contribute to the common good, which all result in different kinds of pleasures. Also, data viz can be used for political ends. So as Lonica argues, who's sitting here, where there is an unequal distribution of power over data, which disadvantages some populations, technologies can redress this balance and aid in the pursuit of social justice, and visualization can be seen as one such tool. So we might think here of tactical technology collectives visualizing information for advocacy, book and project. And as Ros Gill notes, for many academics, scholarly work forms part of a larger advocacy and activism agenda. And so in harnessing data visualization as part of that agenda, DataVis becomes a tool against neoliberal data power, not one that serves it. So that's the complete opposite of what I've just argued now, and hence the roller coaster. And there are also pleasures in engaging with data visualizations as well. And this was one of the major findings of